Dr. Sarah Chin pressed her palm against the reinforced glass of the laboratory window, watching the chaos unfold in the streets below. The morning had started like any other at the centers for disease control in Atlanta, but now sirens wailed through the city as emergency broadcasts crackled over every radio and television. The experimental virus her team had been studying, designed to regenerate dead tissue for medical purposes, had somehow escaped containment. Marcus Rivera, her lead research partner, frantically typed commands into his computer terminal while sweat beaded on his forehead. The security breach happened at 0347 hours, he muttered, his voice barely audible above the emergency alarms. Someone accessed the biocontainment unit without authorization. Sarah's hands trembled as she recalled the missing vials they discovered that morning, each one containing enough of the regenerative compound to affect dozens of people. 3 blocks away, Detective James Morrison crouched behind his patrol car, radio in hand, as he watched ordinary citizens stumble through the streets with jerky, unnatural movements. Their skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and their eyes seemed vacant, devoid of human consciousness. When he'd first responded to reports of violent disturbances downtown, he'd expected another riot or gang conflict. Instead, he found himself facing something that defied all logic and training. The infected individuals, he refused to call them what the panicked radio chatter suggested, showed no response to verbal commands or warning shots. They moved with singular purpose, drawn to any source of noise or movement, their attacks swift and relentless. Morrison had already called for backup 3 times, but the dispatcher's increasingly frantic responses suggested the situation was spiraling beyond control throughout the entire metropolitan area. Inside Mercy General Hospital, Dr. Elena Vasquez worked desperately to treat the first wave of victims brought in by ambulance crews. The patients presented with bite wounds and deep lacerations, but what disturbed her most was their rapid deterioration. Within hours of arrival, their vital signs would flatline, only for them to suddenly reanimate with the same vacant stare and aggressive behavior she'd heard described on the emergency channels. The hospital's security team had already sealed off the emergency ward after 3 patients broke free from their restraints and attacked staff members. Elena knew they needed to evacuate, but with hundreds of patients in the building and the infected multiplying by the hour, she faced an impossible choice between her medical oath and basic survival instincts. Across town, high school teacher Michael Torres barricaded himself and 23 students in the gymnasium after the school's emergency lockdown protocol had failed to contain the crisis. Through the small windows near the ceiling, he could see infected individuals wandering the school corridors, their movements becoming more coordinated as their numbers grew. The children looked to him for answers he didn't have, their faces reflecting the same terror he felt churning in his stomach. His phone buzzed with text messages from parents desperate for information, but the cellular networks were becoming increasingly unreliable as infrastructure began to fail. Torres knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. The infected seemed drawn to the slightest sound, and keeping 23 teenagers completely silent was proving nearly impossible. The first military response came from Colonel David Hayes, who commanded the National Guard unit stationed 15 miles outside Atlanta. His initial reports described the situation as a localized biological incident, but within hours his assessment had changed dramatically. The infected showed no response to non-lethal crowd control measures, and their numbers were doubling every few hours as they spread the contagion through direct contact. Hayes faced a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his days: whether to authorize deadly force against what had once been American citizens. The rules of engagement had never prepared him for an enemy that felt no pain, showed no fear, and could only be stopped by complete destruction of brain tissue. As darkness fell over Atlanta, the various groups of survivors began to realize the true scope of their predicament. The infected had overrun the city's major transportation hubs, making evacuation nearly impossible. Power grids were failing as utility workers either fled or became infected themselves. Most terrifying of all, the infected seemed to be adapting, showing signs of pack behavior and tactical coordination that suggested whatever had changed them was still evolving. Dr. Chen's worst fears were confirmed when she received fragmentary reports from other CDC facilities across the country. The outbreak wasn't contained to Atlanta. The regenerative virus had already spread to major population centers from coast to coast, and with each passing hour, the number of uninfected humans dwindled while the undead army grew stronger and more organized. The fight for humanity's survival had begun, and the odds were rapidly shifting against them. The emergency broadcast crackled through the static-filled radio as Dr. Sarah Chin huddled with Marcus in the abandoned CDC laboratory, now eerily quiet except for the distant sounds of chaos beyond the reinforced walls. All civilians are advised to proceed to Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, where military forces have established a secure perimeter and medical facilities, the robotic voice announced for the 15th time that hour. Marcus looked up from the hard drives he'd been frantically copying, his eyes reflecting the same uncertainty that gnawed at Sarah's stomach. The research data they'd compiled over the past 18 hours could be humanity's only hope of understanding the virus, but carrying the equipment through infected territory seemed like a suicide mission. "We have to try," Sarah whispered, watching through the security monitors as infected individuals wandered the CDC parking lot in seemingly random patterns. "If we don't get this information to someone who can use it, everything we've discovered dies with us." 5 miles across the city, Detective James Morrison crouched behind an overturned ambulance with Dr. Elena Vasquez and 3 other survivors from Mercy General Hospital. The group had been moving through the abandoned streets for 6 hours, using a combination of storm drains, rooftops, and sheer luck to avoid the growing number of infected that roamed the city. Elena clutched a medical bag containing blood samples from patients who'd shown various stages of infection, her knuckles white with tension as she listened to Morrison's plan. "The airport is 12 miles south," he said, pointing to a map spread across the ambulance's hood. "We can follow the freight rail lines for most of the journey, but we'll be exposed during the final approach." Behind them, hospital maintenance worker Carlos Martinez nervously adjusted his makeshift armor, pieces of metal sheeting duct taped to his clothing, while nurse Rebecca Kim checked their dwindling medical supplies. The journey began at dawn, when the infected seemed less active, moving through the skeletal remains of what had been a thriving metropolitan area just 24 hours earlier. Abandoned cars lined the highways like metallic tombstones, their doors hanging open where desperate people had fled on foot. Morrison led the group through residential neighborhoods where the silence was more terrifying than any sound. Houses stood empty with front doors ajar, breakfast tables still set for meals that would never be finished, and children's toys scattered across yards where families had vanished without a trace. Elena found herself treating survivors they encountered along the way, people who'd suffered bites and scratches but hadn't yet succumbed to the infection. Each time she applied bandages or administered pain medication, she wondered if she was helping them or simply postponing the inevitable. The infected began to show disturbing new behaviors as the day progressed. Morrison noticed they were no longer wandering aimlessly but seemed to be following predetermined paths, almost as if they were patrolling assigned territories. When the group took shelter in an abandoned gas station, they watched through the windows as dozens of infected individuals moved past in perfect formation, their movements synchronized like a military unit. "They're learning," Elena whispered, her medical training struggling to process what she was witnessing. "The virus isn't just reanimating dead tissue, it's creating some kind of collective behavior pattern." Carlos crossed himself and muttered prayers in Spanish, while Rebecca documented everything in a small notebook, her hands shaking as she wrote. By midday the group had covered 8 miles, but their progress slowed dramatically as they approached the airport's outer perimeter. The infected had gathered in massive numbers around the facility, drawn by the noise and activity of the military operations. Morrison used binoculars to survey the scene from a highway overpass, counting at least 300 infected individuals surrounding the airport's main terminals. "There's definitely military presence," he reported, pointing to the helicopters circling overhead and the armored vehicles positioned along the runways. "But I can't tell if they're rescuing people or just containing the situation." Elena studied the infected crowd below, noting how they seemed to move in coordinated waves, testing different sections of the military perimeter as if probing for weaknesses. The group's desperate sprint across the final mile became a nightmare of near misses and split-second decisions. They used abandoned vehicles as stepping stones, leaping from roof to roof while infected individuals swarmed around them like angry insects. Carlos stumbled and fell, his makeshift armor clattering against the asphalt as 3 infected converged on his position. Morrison and Elena fought desperately to reach him, using improvised weapons and medical instruments to drive off the attackers. They managed to pull Carlos to safety, but not before he'd suffered deep lacerations on his left arm and shoulder. As they finally reached the airport's military checkpoint, soldiers in hazmat suits processed them through decontamination procedures while medics examined their wounds. The safe zone was real, but Elena couldn't shake the feeling that they'd traded one form of imprisonment for another. The infected continued to gather outside the perimeter in ever-increasing numbers, and the military's defensive positions looked more like preparation for a siege than a rescue operation. Inside the terminal, hundreds of other survivors waited in overcrowded conditions, their faces reflecting the same mixture of relief and uncertainty that Elena felt growing in her own chest as she wondered whether they'd truly found safety or simply postponed their fate. The fluorescent lights of the airport terminal cast harsh shadows across the faces of hundreds of survivors as Colonel David Hayes stepped onto the makeshift platform constructed from airline check-in counters. His uniform was pristine despite the chaos surrounding Atlanta, and his expression remained coldly professional as he addressed the crowd through a portable sound system. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to be clear about our situation," he began, his voice echoing through the cavernous space. "This facility is not a rescue station. It is a quarantine zone established under federal emergency protocols. Anyone showing signs of infection will be immediately isolated for the safety of the general population." Dr. Sarah Chen felt her stomach drop as she clutched the research data she'd risked everything to transport. Behind Hayes, soldiers in full hazmat suits positioned themselves at strategic points throughout the terminal, their weapons clearly visible and ready for use. Michael Torres arrived with his group of 23 students just as Hayes finished his announcement, their faces exhausted from the harrowing journey through the city's infected zones. The teenagers huddled close to their teacher, their eyes wide with fear and confusion as they took in the military's overwhelming presence. Torres noticed immediately that several of his students were showing concerning symptoms: pale skin, slight tremors, and the glassy-eyed stare that had become terrifyingly familiar. 16-year-old Jessica Martinez had been scratched during their escape from the school, and despite Torres's attempts to clean and bandage the wound, angry red lines now spread up her arm like poisonous vines. "Mr. Torres, I don't feel good," she whispered, swaying slightly as she spoke. He pulled her closer, knowing that admitting her condition would mean losing her to the military's ruthless containment protocols. Dr. Elena Vasquez worked frantically in the medical station that had been established near the terminal's former food court, treating survivors while trying to gather data about the infection's progression. What she discovered filled her with growing dread. The virus was far more sophisticated than anyone had initially understood. Patients who'd been bitten showed a consistent pattern of deterioration. Initial symptoms appeared within hours, followed by fever, delirium, and finally death. But the reanimation process wasn't random. The infected retained certain cognitive functions and seemed to be driven by an overwhelming compulsion to spread the virus to others. "Colonel Hayes needs to see this," she told Detective Morrison, who'd been helping coordinate security within the terminal. "The infected aren't just mindless killing machines. They're being controlled by something and they're getting smarter." The situation deteriorated rapidly when military medics began conducting mandatory health screenings on all survivors. Torres watched in horror as soldiers dragged away anyone showing even minor symptoms, their destinations unknown but their fate easily imagined based on the occasional gunshots that echoed from the terminal's restricted sections. When they reached his group of students, Torres made a desperate decision that would haunt him forever. "These children are all healthy," he lied, positioning himself between the medics and Jessica, whose condition was becoming increasingly obvious. The lead medic, Sergeant Williams, wasn't fooled by Torres's deception. "Sir, step aside. We can see that several individuals in your group require immediate medical attention." The confrontation escalated quickly as other survivors began to realize what medical attention really meant in this militarized environment. Dr. Chin attempted to intervene by approaching Colonel Hayes directly, hoping that her CDC credentials and research data might influence his decision-making. "Colonel, I have information about the virus that could be crucial for developing a treatment," she said, holding up the hard drives containing months of research. Hayes examined the data briefly before handing it to one of his technical officers. "Doctor, your research will be forwarded to the appropriate authorities, but it doesn't change our immediate situation. This facility must remain secure, and infected individuals pose an unacceptable risk to the remaining population." When Chin protested that many of the symptomatic people might still be saved, Hayes's response was swift and final. "The time for medical intervention has passed. We're now in damage control mode." The breaking point came when Jessica Martinez collapsed in the middle of the terminal, her body convulsing as the virus reached its final stages. Torres refused to let the soldiers take her, gathering his remaining students around the dying girl in a protective circle. Other survivors began to join them, including Elena, Morrison, and several hospital workers who'd grown disgusted with the military's callous treatment of the infected. "She's just a child," Torres shouted, his voice breaking with emotion. "How can you execute children?" The standoff lasted for tense minutes before Hayes gave the order that shattered any remaining trust between the military and civilians. "Sergeant Williams, clear the obstruction. Use whatever force is necessary." The soldiers raised their weapons and the terminal filled with screams as survivors realized they weren't being protected. They were being processed like cattle, sorted into categories of useful and expendable. The violence that followed was brief but devastating. Morrison and several other survivors fought back against the soldiers, using improvised weapons and desperate courage to create chaos in the terminal. During the confusion, Torres managed to evacuate most of his students through an emergency exit, while Elena and Chin gathered what medical supplies they could carry. As they fled into the night, leaving behind the false promise of safety, the survivors realized that the infected weren't their only enemy. In this new world, those who claimed to offer protection might prove to be the most dangerous threat of all. The abandoned subway tunnels beneath Atlanta stretched endlessly into darkness, their concrete walls weeping with moisture and decades of urban decay. Dr. Sarah Chin set up her makeshift laboratory in what had once been a maintenance alcove, using battery-powered equipment and improvised tools to continue her research into the virus that had destroyed civilization above ground. The steady drip of water from corroded pipes provided a rhythmic soundtrack to her work as she analyzed blood samples from the survivors, searching for any clue that might explain why some people seemed more resistant to infection than others. Marcus helped her organize the research data they'd salvaged from the CDC, his movements careful and deliberate in the confined space that had become their new home. "We're not just hiding down here," Sarah reminded herself and the others. "We're buying time to find a solution." Detective James Morrison had transformed from a law enforcement officer into something resembling a military commander, organizing the 37 survivors who'd followed them into the tunnels after the airport catastrophe. He established guard rotations at the tunnel entrances, created supply inventories, and developed protocols for venturing to the surface when resources ran low. The group included Michael Torres and 15 of his students, Dr. Elena Vasquez and several hospital staff members, plus various civilians who joined their exodus from the airport. Morrison studied hand-drawn maps of the tunnel system, marking safe routes and identifying potential emergency exits while trying to ignore the scratching sounds that echoed from the deeper passages. "Something's down there with us," he confided to Elena during one of their planning sessions. "The infected are learning to navigate underground, and they're getting closer every day." The surface expeditions became increasingly dangerous as the infected demonstrated new levels of coordination and intelligence. During a supply run to an abandoned pharmacy, Torres witnessed something that chilled him to the bone. A group of infected individuals working together to set up what appeared to be an ambush. They had positioned themselves strategically around the building's entrances, remaining perfectly still until his team was fully committed to entering the structure. Only quick thinking and a hastily improvised distraction allowed the survivors to escape, but not before Torres realized that the infected were no longer just hunting, they were planning. "They're remembering things," he reported to the others upon returning to the tunnels. "Human memories, tactical knowledge, problem-solving abilities. The virus isn't destroying their minds, it's repurposing them." Elena's medical station in the tunnels became a hub of discovery and growing concern as she treated injuries from the surface expeditions and studied the progression of the virus in controlled conditions. She had begun to suspect that certain individuals possessed natural immunity or resistance to the infection, but her research was hampered by limited equipment and the constant threat of discovery. The breakthrough came when she analyzed her own blood samples and discovered antibodies that seemed to neutralize the virus in laboratory conditions. "I've been exposed multiple times," she explained to Sarah and the others. "Direct contact with infected blood, saliva, even bite wounds that somehow didn't take hold. My immune system is producing something that fights the virus." The discovery offered hope, but also made Elena a target. If the infected were truly developing collective intelligence, they might eventually realize that eliminating immune individuals was crucial to their survival. The tunnels themselves began to reveal their own secrets and dangers as the survivors explored deeper into the underground network. Morrison discovered that the subway system connected to storm drains, utility tunnels, and even forgotten passages from Atlanta's Prohibition era. These connections offered multiple escape routes but also provided access points that the infected could use to infiltrate their sanctuary. The group established a complex early warning system using improvised alarms and communication devices, but the constant vigilance took its toll on everyone's mental state. Children cried in the darkness, adults argued over resource allocation, and the ever-present threat of discovery made sleep nearly impossible for most of the survivors. The infected's adaptation to underground environments became terrifyingly evident when they discovered the first breach in the tunnel system. Morrison found evidence that infected individuals had somehow accessed the storm drains and were systematically exploring the underground network. Scratch marks on the walls, dried blood stains, and the unmistakable odor of decomposition indicated that the infected were not only navigating the tunnels but also establishing their own presence in the underground world. They're not just hunting us, Sarah realized as she examined the evidence. They're colonizing, creating a network that mirrors our own, but with them as the dominant species. The revelation forced the survivors to confront a horrifying truth. Nowhere was truly safe anymore, and the infected were evolving faster than humanity could adapt. As the group prepared for what might be their final stand in the tunnels, Elena worked frantically to synthesize her antibodies into a treatment that might help other survivors. The race against time intensified when they discovered that the infected had found multiple access points to their section of the tunnel system. The survivors faced an impossible choice: risk everything in a desperate attempt to reach the surface and find a new sanctuary, or make their final stand in the darkness below, fighting for humanity's survival with improvised weapons and dwindling hope against an enemy that grew stronger and smarter with each passing day. The tremors started at dawn, a rhythmic vibration that seemed to emanate from the very bones of the earth itself. Dr. Sarah Chun looked up from her microscope, her hand instinctively reaching for the tunnel wall to steady herself as dust cascaded from the ceiling overhead. The sensation was unlike anything she'd experienced, not the random footsteps of scattered infected individuals, but something far more organized and terrifying. Marcus rushed to the tunnel entrance with a seismic detector they'd improvised from hospital equipment, his face pale as he read the measurements. "Sarah, you need to see this," he called, his voice barely above a whisper. "The readings are off the charts. There are thousands of them moving in perfect synchronization, and they're all heading in the same direction." Through the storm drain grating that served as their primary observation point, they could see the massive migration beginning to unfold above ground. Detective James Morrison pressed his binoculars against his eyes, watching in horrified fascination as an endless stream of infected individuals moved through the streets with military precision. They no longer stumbled or wandered aimlessly. Instead, they marched in coordinated columns, their movements synchronized like a grotesque parade. The infected had organized themselves into distinct groups: scouts who moved ahead of the main force, flankers who secured the perimeter, and what appeared to be command units that directed the overall movement. "They're not just migrating," Morrison reported to the others. "They're conducting a strategic redeployment. This is military-level organization, and they're heading toward every major population center on the eastern seaboard." The implications were staggering. If the infected could coordinate on this scale, no surviving human settlement would be safe from their overwhelming numbers. Dr. Elena Vasquez worked frantically to document the migration patterns while continuing her research into the virus's effects on human consciousness. Her observations through the tunnel's monitoring systems revealed that the infected were communicating through subsonic frequencies, vibrations that traveled through the ground and air in patterns too complex for human perception. "It's like they're operating on a shared wavelength," she explained to Michael Torres, who was helping her record the data. "The virus hasn't just reanimated their bodies, it's connected their minds into a collective network. They're sharing information, coordinating strategies, and adapting to our defensive measures in real time." The discovery explained why the infected had become increasingly difficult to evade and why their behavior seemed to anticipate the survivors' movements with uncanny accuracy. The tunnel system that had provided sanctuary for the survivors suddenly became a trap as the infected began systematically searching every underground passage in the city. Torres led a reconnaissance mission through the maintenance tunnels, only to discover that the infected had deployed specialized units into the subway system. These underground hunters moved with purpose and intelligence, using their enhanced senses to track human scent and their collective knowledge to navigate the complex tunnel network. "They're not just searching randomly," Torres reported upon his return. "They're mapping the entire underground infrastructure, and they're coordinating with the surface units to create a comprehensive containment strategy." The survivors realized that their hideout had been discovered, and it was only a matter of time before the infected pinpointed their exact location. The scale of the migration became truly apparent when Chen accessed the tunnel system's emergency communication network and picked up fragmentary radio transmissions from other survivor groups across the region. The reports painted a terrifying picture. Massive hordes of infected were converging on Washington, D.C., New York City, Philadelphia, and every other major metropolitan area within a 500-mile radius. The infected weren't just spreading randomly, they were executing a coordinated campaign to eliminate the remaining human population centers. "They're not just hunting us anymore," Chin realized as she listened to the desperate radio chatter. "They're systematically exterminating our species with the efficiency of a military operation." The virus had transformed the infected into something beyond human comprehension, a collective organism with a singular goal of total domination. As the migration reached its peak intensity, the survivors faced the horrifying realization that hiding was no longer a viable strategy. The infected were conducting a comprehensive sweep of every possible hiding place, using their collective intelligence to eliminate any location where humans might survive. Morrison gathered the group for what might be their final planning session, his voice steady despite the desperate circumstances. "We have two choices," he said, studying the maps they'd compiled of the infected's movement patterns. "We can try to break through their lines and reach one of the rumored safe zones in the mountains, or we can make our stand here and try to disrupt their coordination somehow." Elena looked up from her research, her eyes reflecting both determination and fear. "There might be a third option," she said quietly. "If we can find a way to interfere with their collective consciousness, we might be able to create enough chaos to give humanity a fighting chance." The survivors spent their final hours in the tunnels preparing for a desperate gambit that would determine the fate of the human race. As the infected closed in on their position, Chin, Elena, and Marcus worked to combine their research into a weapon that might disrupt the virus's collective network. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the tunnels, and the survivors knew that their time for hiding had ended. Now they would either find a way to fight back against the unstoppable horde, or humanity would face extinction in the darkness below the city. The abandoned Emory University pharmaceutical facility loomed against the gray Atlanta skyline like a monument to humanity's lost scientific achievements. Dr. Sarah Chin studied the building through night vision binoculars, her heart pounding as she counted the dozens of infected individuals that had made the research complex their nest. The facility contained the specialized equipment and chemical compounds she needed to synthesize Elena's antibodies into a weapon that might disrupt the infected's collective consciousness, but reaching it would require the most dangerous mission the survivors had ever attempted. Marcus checked his improvised explosive devices one final time, knowing that their plan depended on precise timing and more luck than any of them had a right to expect. "The infected are most active during daylight hours," he whispered to the assault team. "We'll have maybe 3 hours before they realize we're inside, and then all hell breaks loose." Detective James Morrison led the diversionary team through the facility's eastern entrance, using noise-making devices and flares to draw the infected away from the main laboratory building. The infected responded exactly as predicted, their collective intelligence directing them toward the perceived threat with military precision. Morrison watched through his scope as hundreds of infected individuals poured out of the building like angry wasps, their movements coordinated but predictable. "Phase 1 complete," he radioed to Chen's team. "You've got a clear path to the lab, but I can't guarantee how long we can keep them distracted." The plan was simple in concept but terrifyingly complex in execution. Create enough chaos to mask the real objective while Elena and Chen worked to synthesize the antibody weapon that might represent humanity's last hope for survival. Dr. Elena Vasquez felt the familiar sting of adrenaline as she followed Chen through the facility's darkened corridors, her medical bag heavy with blood samples and research notes. The pharmaceutical lab was a scientist's dream, state-of-the-art equipment, chemical storage systems, and computer networks that had somehow remained functional despite the collapse of civilization. But the building also contained evidence of the infected's evolving intelligence. Makeshift barriers constructed from furniture and debris, patrol routes marked with human blood, and what appeared to be a primitive communication system using scratches and symbols carved into the walls. "They're not just nesting here," Elena realized as she examined the markings. "They're building something. A command center for coordinating their activities across the entire region." The discovery added urgency to their mission, but it also revealed how sophisticated the infected had become in their war against humanity. The synthesis process required Elena to work with her own blood while Chin operated the complex machinery needed to mass-produce the antibody compound. As Elena drew vial after vial of her precious immune-rich blood, she felt her strength ebbing but forced herself to continue. The antibodies in her system represented the only known natural defense against the virus, and creating enough of the compound to affect the infected's collective consciousness would require nearly every drop she could safely donate. "I can feel them getting closer," she told Chin, her voice growing weaker with each extraction. "The infected are adapting to Morrison's diversionary tactics. They're sending search parties back to the building." Chin worked frantically with the pharmaceutical equipment, her hands shaking as she combined Elena's antibodies with chemical amplifiers that would allow the compound to be dispersed through the air. Marcus Rivera's demolition expertise became crucial when the infected began systematically clearing the facility room by room, their search patterns indicating they'd identified the laboratory as the source of the human presence. His explosive devices had been carefully placed to channel the infected into predetermined kill zones, but the enemy's collective intelligence allowed them to adapt faster than he'd anticipated. "They're learning from each explosion," he reported over the radio. "Adjusting their approach patterns, sending smaller groups to test our defenses. We're running out of time and ammunition." The infected's ability to sacrifice individual units for tactical advantage made them nearly impossible to stop through conventional means, forcing Marcus to improvise increasingly desperate countermeasures. The mission's climax came when Michael Torres discovered that the infected had been using the facility's basement levels to establish a breeding ground for newly infected individuals. The sight that greeted him in the underground chambers was beyond anything he'd imagined. Hundreds of recently infected people in various stages of transformation, their bodies connected by organic tendrils that seemed to facilitate the collective consciousness. "It's not just a nest," he radioed to the others, his voice filled with horror. "It's a factory. They're not just converting humans, they're integrating them into some kind of biological network." The discovery revealed that the infected were building towards something far more sinister than simple territorial expansion. They were creating a new form of life that would replace humanity entirely. As the infected breached the laboratory's final defenses, Elena made the ultimate sacrifice by injecting herself with an experimental overdose of her own synthesized antibodies. The compound coursed through her system, causing her body to produce massive quantities of the antiviral agents while simultaneously broadcasting a signal that disrupted the infected's collective consciousness. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Infected individuals throughout the facility began to collapse as their shared network fractured. Elena's final act gave the survivors the weapon they needed, but at the cost of her life and the realization that their war against the infected had only just begun. Marcus Rivera stumbled through the pharmaceutical facility's emergency exit, his left arm hanging uselessly at his side where the infected individual had torn through his makeshift armor during the laboratory evacuation. The bite wound burned like molten metal beneath his hastily applied bandages, and he could feel the virus already beginning its insidious work on his cellular structure. But as he rejoined the surviving members of their group, Dr. Sarah Chin, Detective Morrison, Michael Torres, and the remaining students, Marcus made a conscious decision to hide his condition for as long as possible. Elena's sacrifice had given them the antibody weapon they needed, but her death had left them without their only source of immunity research. "We did it," he told the others, forcing strength into his voice despite the fever that was already beginning to cloud his thoughts. "We have enough of the compound to disrupt their network, but we need to find a way to deploy it on a massive scale." The sound of approaching helicopters cut through the morning air as Colonel David Hayes arrived with what remained of his military forces, their vehicles forming a defensive perimeter around the survivors' position. Hayes had spent the past 48 hours implementing increasingly desperate measures to contain the infected outbreak, including the systematic destruction of entire city blocks and the deployment of experimental weapons that had proven largely ineffective against the evolving enemy. "Dr. Chin," he called out, his previously pristine uniform now stained with smoke and blood from the battles he'd fought across the region. "I've received word about your research from the CDC remnants. If you've truly developed a weapon that can disrupt their collective consciousness, then we need to discuss immediate deployment strategies." His tone suggested cooperation, but Sarah noticed the way his soldiers positioned themselves around the group, less like protectors and more like guards preparing for another containment operation. The revelation of Hayes' true intentions came when he outlined his Scorched Earth Protocol, a plan to deploy nuclear weapons against the major infected population centers, effectively sacrificing millions of potentially recoverable humans to ensure the virus couldn't spread beyond the eastern seaboard. "The infected have demonstrated strategic capabilities that exceed our ability to contain them through conventional means," Hayes explained, showing the survivors satellite images of the massive hordes converging on major cities. "Washington, D.C., New York, Philadelphia, they're all lost. Our only option is complete sterilization of the affected areas, followed by a 10-year quarantine period to ensure total eradication." Chin stared at the colonel in horror, realizing that the military's solution was essentially human extinction delivered through atomic fire. "There has to be another way," she protested. "Elena's compound worked. We can disrupt their network without destroying everything." Marcus felt the virus reaching the final stages of its progression as his vision began to blur and his motor control started to deteriorate. The bite wound on his arm had turned black, with red streaks spreading up toward his shoulder like poisonous lightning. He could sense his human consciousness beginning to fragment, replaced by something alien and collective that whispered seductive promises of unity and purpose. But in the last moments of his humanity, Marcus made a choice that would define the survivors' final battle. "Sarah," he said, his voice already changing as the virus rewrote his neural pathways. "I need you to listen carefully. I can feel them in my head, their network, their plans, their weaknesses. The compound doesn't just disrupt their consciousness, it causes them pain, makes them vulnerable. But you have to get me close to their central hub." His eyes were beginning to lose their human warmth, but his determination remained absolutely clear. The infected assault began at sunset, with thousands of them emerging from the city's ruins in coordinated waves that tested every defensive position the military had established. Morrison found himself fighting alongside the same soldiers who had threatened to execute civilians at the airport, their previous conflicts forgotten in the face of humanity's potential extinction. The infected moved with terrifying intelligence, using human shields captured from other survivor groups and employing tactical formations that countered every defensive strategy Hayes' forces could deploy. "They're not just attacking," Morrison realized as he watched the battle unfold from his sniper position. "They're herding us toward something, concentrating all the remaining humans in one location for a final assault." The infected seemed willing to accept massive casualties to achieve their strategic objectives, suggesting that their collective consciousness had calculated the exact cost of eliminating humanity's last resistance. Torres led the surviving students in a desperate charge to reach the infected's command center, using Marcus as both guide and weapon as his transformation reached completion. The infected researcher retained enough human memory to navigate their network while Elena's synthesized antibodies in his system created chaos wherever he went. "I can see their entire structure," Marcus reported through the radio, his voice becoming increasingly inhuman with each transmission. "The central hub is underground, beneath the CDC building. If we can get the compound to their source, we can bring down the whole network. But the mission would require the ultimate sacrifice from everyone involved." And as the infected closed in from all directions, the survivors realized that saving humanity might cost them their own lives. The final battle had begun, and only one species would emerge victorious from the ruins of Atlanta. The underground chambers beneath the CDC building pulsed with an otherworldly energy as Dr. Sarah Chen descended into the heart of the infected's collective consciousness. The walls themselves seemed alive, covered in organic growths that connected hundreds of infected individuals in a vast neural network that stretched for miles beneath Atlanta. Marcus led the way through the twisted corridors, his transformed body serving as both guide and living weapon as Elena's antibodies continued to disrupt the network wherever he went. "The central hub is just ahead," he said, his voice now barely recognizable as human but his determination unwavering. Behind them, Detective Morrison and Michael Torres fought a desperate rearguard action against infected reinforcements, buying precious time for the mission that would determine humanity's survival. The sight that greeted them in the central chamber defied all human comprehension. A massive organic structure that resembled a combination of brain tissue and computer circuitry, with thousands of neural pathways connecting infected individuals across the entire eastern seaboard. Dr. Chen realized that the infected hadn't just evolved, they had become something entirely new, a hybrid organism that combined human intelligence with viral efficiency. "It's beautiful and terrible," she whispered, studying the pulsing network that had replaced human civilization with something alien and purposeful. The central hub responded to their presence by sending waves of defensive infected toward their position, but Marcus's disrupted biology created gaps in their coordination that allowed the team to advance deeper into the complex. Colonel Hayes' nuclear countdown reached its final minutes as Sarah worked frantically to deploy Elena's synthesized antibody compound throughout the infected's neural network. The military leader had positioned his forces above ground, ready to implement the scorched earth protocol that would sterilize the entire region regardless of whether the survivors succeeded in their mission. "Dr. Chin, you have exactly 8 minutes before we initiate complete sterilization," Hayes' voice crackled through her radio. "If your compound doesn't work, we're eliminating everything, infected and human alike." The weight of species survival rested on Sarah's ability to introduce the antibody weapon into the central hub before Hayes' atomic solution rendered the question moot. The infected's final desperate defense came in the form of a massive coordinated assault that brought thousands of them pouring into the underground facility. Morrison and Torres found themselves overwhelmed by sheer numbers, their ammunition depleted and their improvised weapons breaking under constant use. "Sarah, whatever you're going to do, do it now," Morrison shouted over the sound of approaching footsteps and inhuman screams. The infected seemed to understand that their entire existence was threatened, and they threw everything they had against the small group of humans who dared to challenge their new world order. Torres made the ultimate sacrifice by detonating the last of their explosives to seal off the main access tunnel, buying Sarah precious minutes but trapping himself on the wrong side of the collapse. Marcus's transformation reached its completion just as Sarah located the central hub's main nerve cluster, a massive organic brain that coordinated the infected's collective consciousness across hundreds of miles. But instead of losing his humanity entirely, Marcus retained enough of his original personality to make one final choice. "I can feel all of them," he told Sarah, his eyes now completely black but his voice filled with human emotion. "Every infected individual, every thought, every plan. Elena's antibodies aren't just disrupting them, they're giving me control." He placed his hands on the central hub's neural interface, and the entire underground complex shuddered as his hybrid consciousness began to override the infected's collective programming. The cascade effect was immediate and catastrophic for the infected network. Across Atlanta and beyond, infected individuals began to collapse as their shared consciousness fragmented under the assault of Elena's antibodies channeled through Marcus's transformed biology. Sarah watched in amazement as the organic machinery around them withered and died, the neural pathways that had connected millions of infected minds dissolving like salt in water. "It's working," she radioed to Hayes, hoping to stop the nuclear countdown. "The network is collapsing, we're winning." But the victory came at an unimaginable cost. Marcus's sacrifice had saved humanity, but it had also eliminated any chance of reversing the infection in the millions who had already been transformed. 6 months later, Sarah stood on the observation deck of the new settlement they'd established in the ruins of downtown Atlanta, watching the sunrise paint the abandoned city in shades of gold and orange. The infected were gone, their bodies having simply shut down when their collective consciousness collapsed, but the world they left behind was a hollow shell of human civilization. Morrison served as the settlement security chief, Torres had become their education coordinator for the handful of children who survived, and Colonel Hayes worked to rebuild communication networks with other survivor groups across the continent. The population of their small community numbered only 237 souls, all that remained of Atlanta's former millions. Elena's research lived on in the medical facility Sarah had established, where she continued to study immunity factors and work toward preventing future outbreaks. The infected were gone, but the virus remained dormant in the environment, waiting for the right conditions to emerge again. As Sarah watched the sun rise over their fragile new civilization, she reflected on the cost of survival and the responsibility that came with being among humanity's remnants. They had won the war against the infected, but rebuilding the world would require a different kind of courage. The determination to preserve their humanity while learning from the mistakes that had nearly led to their extinction.